India's $23 billion gamble, the rise and fall of Modi's manufacturing dream. In the global race to reshape manufacturing, one nation placed a massive bet on becoming the next industrial powerhouse. India, home to over 1.4 billion people, embarked on an ambitious journey to challenge China's decades-long dominance in global production. What seemed like a promising alternative quickly unraveled into one of the most expensive policy failures of the decade. The story begins in 2021, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi's administration unveiled what they called a game-changing initiative, the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, known as PLI. This wasn't just another economic policy. It was presented as India's pathway to becoming World Factory 2.0. With a staggering commitment of $23 billion in subsidies, the Indian government aimed to lure manufacturers away from China and establish the subcontinent as the new epicenter of global production. Western media outlets quickly amplified the narrative. Headlines proclaimed India as the inevitable successor to China's manufacturing throne. Major corporations, from tech giants to automotive leaders, announced their intentions to expand operations across Indian states. The momentum seemed unstoppable, and the vision appeared within reach. But 4 years later, in March 2025, reality delivered a harsh verdict. The initiative that was supposed to revolutionize India's economy had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and systemic challenges. Not only did the plan fail to meet its objectives, but India's manufacturing sector actually shrank as a percentage of the national economy, dropping from 15.4% to just 14.3% of GDP. Perhaps most revealing of all of the promised $23 billion in subsidies, the government had distributed merely $1.73 billion, less than 8% of the total pledge. What went wrong? How did such a high-profile, internationally watched initiative fall so dramatically short? And what does this mean for the future of global manufacturing? To understand this industrial tragedy, we need to examine not just what happened, but why the fundamentals were flawed from the very beginning. The origins of India's manufacturing ambition. The roots of this story stretch back to 2014, when Narendra Modi first assumed the office of Prime Minister. Among his central campaign promises was a commitment to transform India into a manufacturing powerhouse. His government set an ambitious target to increase manufacturing's share of GDP to 25% and create 100 million new jobs in the sector. The logic seemed straightforward. China had risen from relative poverty to become the world's factory floor within a few decades. If one developing nation could achieve such a transformation, why couldn't another? India possessed several apparent advantages: a massive labor pool, growing technical expertise, democratic governance, and increasingly favorable treatment from Western nations seeking to diversify their supply chains away from China. This last point became especially significant during Donald Trump's first presidency. The United States actively encouraged American companies to explore Indian manufacturing as part of a broader strategy to reduce dependence on Chinese production. Corporate giants responded to these signals. Apple began discussions about expanding iPhone assembly in India. Tesla explored the possibility of establishing manufacturing facilities. The narrative of Made in India replacing Made in China gained traction in boardrooms across Silicon Valley and beyond. By 2021, conditions seemed perfect for a major push. Geopolitical tensions between Washington and Beijing had intensified. The COVID-19 pandemic had exposed vulnerabilities in concentrated supply chains. Global corporations were genuinely interested in diversification. Against this backdrop, Modi's government launched the PLI scheme with enormous fanfare. The program targeted 14 strategic sectors: electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, textiles, aviation, steel, food processing, and others deemed critical for economic development. The government's pitch to companies was simple and attractive: meet production targets in India and receive substantial cash incentives. No loans to repay, no equity to surrender, just direct payments for hitting manufacturing milestones. Within months, over 750 companies had signed agreements to participate. Foxconn, Apple's primary manufacturing partner, committed to expanding its Indian operations significantly. Media reports suggested that global supply chains were indeed beginning to shift toward the Ganges River basin. The dream of becoming the next China appeared to be materializing. The promise versus the reality. On paper, the PLI scheme addressed a critical challenge facing India's industrial development capital intensity. Modern manufacturing requires enormous upfront investment in facilities, equipment, and workforce training. By offering guaranteed subsidies tied to production volumes, the government hoped to reduce the financial risk for companies willing to build or expand in India. The original calculations projected dramatic results. Manufacturing's contribution to GDP would nearly double, from roughly 13% to 25%. Millions of jobs would be created across various industrial sectors. India would integrate deeply into global value chains, moving beyond its traditional strengths in services and software to become a major producer of physical goods. International observers initially viewed the initiative favorably. Unlike previous Indian industrial policies that had languished due to poor implementation, the PLI scheme appeared focused and well-funded. The sectors targeted were those where global demand was growing and where China's dominance created genuine concern among Western policymakers. However, warning signs emerged quickly. By October 2024, more than 3 years into the program, participating companies had achieved only 37% of their production targets. This wasn't a minor shortfall. It represented a fundamental failure to execute. The gap between ambition and achievement had grown into a chasm. The subsidy distribution told an even more troubling story. Of the $1.73 billion actually dispersed, an overwhelming 94% went to just 2 sectors: pharmaceuticals and mobile phone manufacturing. These happen to be industries with the heaviest dependence on Chinese raw materials and technical support. In essence, Indian subsidies were indirectly flowing back to support Chinese suppliers. Meanwhile, sectors deemed equally strategic received almost nothing. Steel manufacturing, textile production, solar panel assembly, industries that could have generated massive employment and developed indigenous capabilities, were largely neglected. The program that promised balanced industrial development had instead created a lopsided outcome that reinforced rather than reduced dependence on Chinese inputs. Dr. Arun Mohan Sukumar, a prominent Indian economist, summarized the situation bluntly in a media interview. When a comprehensive plan of this scale fails to deliver even basic results, we must question not just the execution but the fundamental assumptions. The most damaging aspect of the PLI failure wasn't really the unmet targets or the undistributed subsidies. It was the message sent to international investors. Over a period of 4 years, more than 2,000 companies that had initially signed agreements either scaled back their plans dramatically or, well, withdrew from India entirely. Consider the case of Wistron, a major Apple supplier. The company waited for about 18 months for the promised subsidies to materialize. During that time, it had already invested in facilities and equipment worth approximately $400 million. When the subsidies failed to arrive and regulatory complications just kept mounting, Wistron made the difficult decision to dismantle its operations and redeploy assets elsewhere. The message was clear. India's promises couldn't really be relied upon. Even India's wealthiest industrialists weren't immune. Gautam Adani, whose conglomerate spans energy, infrastructure, and logistics, faced repeated delays in subsidy approvals for his manufacturing ventures. Projects that were supposed to showcase India's industrial renaissance instead became, honestly, emblematic of bureaucratic dysfunction, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, despite backing from the nation's richest individual. Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics manufacturer that employs over 1 million workers globally, encountered situations so absurd they almost seemed designed to fail. Equipment would arrive at Indian facilities, but couldn't be installed because technicians simply weren't available. Why? Well, because India had simultaneously launched a strict visa policy restricting Chinese technical workers, the very people who actually knew how to set up and operate the sophisticated machinery. Now, the pharmaceutical sector provided its own ironic twist. Sun Pharmaceutical, marketed as a company that would reduce India's dependence on Chinese drug precursors, found itself unable to operate when subsidies for key raw material sectors were suspended. The company still had to import 80% of its chemical inputs from China, but now without the financial support that was supposed to make local production viable. In the steel sector, 14 out of 58 approved projects were canceled outright due to lack of progress. The textile industry suffered even more dramatically. Approximately 50,000 small and medium-sized factories closed their doors. These weren't major corporations that could absorb losses. They were family businesses and regional employers whose failure really rippled through local communities. The timing of this manufacturing collapse coincided with broader economic headwinds. Starting in October 2024, foreign institutional investors accelerated their withdrawal from Indian markets. Capital that had once flowed into the Bombay Stock Exchange, seeking exposure to India's growth story, began flowing out at a rate of roughly $420 million daily. Simultaneously, many of these same investors increased their holdings in Chinese equities, a dramatic reversal that really underscored shifting confidence. The China paradox: dependency amid hostility. Perhaps nothing illustrates the contradictions in India's approach more starkly than its relationship with China during this period. Even as the Indian government promoted the PLI scheme as a tool for reducing Chinese influence, the country's dependence on Chinese inputs actually deepened. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Between 2020 and 2024, India reduced visa issuances to Chinese citizens by 99%, from approximately 200,000 per year to just 2,000. The stated goal was to limit Chinese influence and encourage indigenous technical development. The actual result was that factories sat idle, imported equipment remained uninstalled, and direct economic losses exceeded $15 billion. Meanwhile, trade between the two nations continued to grow. By March 2025, China had reclaimed its position as India's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade reaching $118.4 billion. This figure represented not a decrease in dependency, but an increase, a humbling acknowledgement that India's economy couldn't function without Chinese inputs, regardless of political rhetoric. The mobile phone industry provides a perfect case study. Indian manufacturers proudly marketed devices as made in India, and technically they were assembled within the country. However, approximately 70% of critical components, including chips, displays, and batteries, originated from Chinese suppliers. Even the small screws holding these devices together often came from Chinese manufacturers. In the automotive sector, the situation was similar. When India's Tata Group inaugurated a new electric vehicle factory with much fanfare, journalists touring the facility noted that roughly 80% of the parts on the assembly line bore Chinese-language labels. The indigenous manufacturing dream was, quite literally, built on Chinese foundations. The solar energy sector showed the same pattern. India has ambitious renewable energy targets and positioned solar manufacturing as a strategic priority. Yet the industry remained overwhelmingly dependent on Chinese silicon wafers and manufacturing equipment. Without these inputs, domestic production would simply cease. Pharmaceuticals, one of India's traditional strengths and a recipient of substantial PLI subsidies, imported approximately 70% of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. The subsidies, rather than creating indigenous capability, essentially provided Indian companies with funds to purchase Chinese precursors and add value through formulation and packaging. Some Indian analysts blame China for this predicament. One frequently cited argument suggested that Chinese manufacturers deliberately kept prices low to prevent Indian competitors from developing their own supply chains. While pricing strategies certainly played a role, this explanation overlooked fundamental issues of scale, efficiency, and integrated industrial ecosystems that China had spent decades building. The visa restrictions produced particularly absurd situations. Chinese companies won contracts to supply equipment to Indian factories. The equipment arrived, but the engineers who could install and commission it were denied visas. In one documented case, machinery worth approximately $12 billion sat unused or was scrapped entirely because the technical personnel needed to operate it couldn't enter the country. This wasn't a Chinese conspiracy to undermine India. It was a policy-owned goal of spectacular proportions.
Bureaucracy, the factory killer. If dependency on China was a self-inflicted wound, India's legendary bureaucracy delivered the killing blow to manufacturing ambitions. The administrative complexity of operating in India had been a running joke among international business leaders for decades. The PLI scheme, rather than streamlining processes, often added new layers of complexity. Companies seeking PLI subsidies faced requirements to submit 7 different categories of supporting documentation. The approval timeline averaged 18 months, a period during which market conditions could change dramatically. Technologies could become obsolete, and investor patience could evaporate. Industry surveys found that over 60% of applicant companies eventually abandoned their subsidy claims simply because the time and resources required for approval exceeded the value of the subsidy itself. But even companies that successfully navigated the approval process weren't safe. India's tax enforcement agencies maintained a reputation for aggressive and unpredictable action against foreign companies. The pattern was consistent enough that legal experts began advising clients that operating in India meant accepting a certain level of harassment as a cost of doing business. Consider the experience of major corporations. Tesla, during exploratory discussions about building manufacturing facilities in India, discovered that obtaining necessary approvals would require coordination across 48 different government departments. Each had its own requirements, timelines, and potential for delays. The complexity made even preliminary planning nearly impossible. Walmart, the American retail giant, received a $2.3 million fine from environmental regulators. The alleged violation? Destroying peacock habitat during a warehouse construction project. Whether the charge had merit or not, the incident demonstrated how companies could face unexpected penalties from any direction. Japan's SoftBank, despite being a major investor in Indian technology companies, submitted a $500 million funding application that was stuck in the Environmental Protection Bureau for 14 months with no clear timeline for resolution. Apple, the company perhaps most prominently associated with expanding manufacturing in India, waited 18 months for subsidy approval at one assembly facility. During this waiting period, the tax department issued a $320 million inspection notice, a massive financial threat that appeared to materialize out of nowhere. Chinese smartphone manufacturers faced especially aggressive treatment. Xiaomi had $580 million in assets frozen by Indian authorities over alleged foreign exchange violations. Vivo's offices were raided by enforcement agencies. Oppo was forced to halt some production lines amid regulatory pressures. Whether these actions were justified or represented protectionist harassment, they sent a clear signal to international manufacturers. India was a high-risk environment. The retail sector saw similar patterns. Amazon closed approximately 65% of its Indian operations after years of regulatory challenges and unclear rules about foreign investment in e-commerce. Walmart received a $150 million fine for purportedly violating online commerce regulations that remained ambiguous even to legal experts. Automotive manufacturers weren't spared. Volkswagen faced demands for $1.4 billion in tariff payments based on reinterpretations of trade classifications. Kia received tax collection notices totaling $175 million, despite having followed guidance from government advisors when structuring its operations. Most recently, Samsung Electronics received a $600 million fine for alleged tariff fraud, an amount roughly equal to the company's Indian profits for 6 months. Additionally, the Samsung Group itself faced a $600 million penalty, while 7 Samsung executives were individually fined $81 million. The CEO of Samsung Electronics India commented with barely concealed frustration, "We're not manufacturing products anymore. We're navigating a bureaucratic obstacle course." Analysts estimate that over the past 5 years, India collected more than $20 billion from foreign companies through tariff disputes, tax investigations, foreign exchange enforcement actions, and various penalties. This sum represented approximately 40% of India's annual military budget, suggesting that extracting money from foreign corporations had become a significant revenue strategy, intentionally or not. Structural impediments beyond policy. While bureaucratic dysfunction and policy contradictions severely hampered India's manufacturing ambitions, deeper structural problems would have challenged even perfectly executed programs. Start with human capital. India's education system has produced impressive results at the elite level. Its engineers and computer scientists are globally competitive. However, the manufacturing sector requires broad-based technical competency across large workforces. Here, India faces significant deficits. Approximately 65% of Indian workers in manufacturing have only completed primary education. Just 15% have received any form of vocational or technical training. The gap in skilled technicians exceeds 1 million workers, and this shortfall becomes more acute for specialized positions requiring intermediate technical knowledge. You can't build complex electronics or precision automotive components without workers who can read technical schematics, operate sophisticated equipment, and perform quality control. Infrastructure presents equally formidable challenges. Logistics costs in India consume roughly 14% of GDP, nearly double the figure in developed economies and significantly higher than in China. Moving goods 100 kilometers within India typically requires 5 different transfers between transportation modes. Cargo damage rates reach 30%, destroying value and making just-in-time manufacturing systems nearly impossible to implement. Electricity reliability remains problematic even in designated industrial zones. Power outages averaging 8 hours daily force factories to invest in expensive backup generators, adding to operational costs and reducing efficiency. Modern manufacturing, especially in electronics and pharmaceuticals, requires extremely stable power supplies. Frequent disruptions damage equipment and ruin production batches. Port infrastructure, while improving, still lags far behind competitors. Container processing times are longer, dwell periods are extended, and coordination between shipping lines, customs, and inland transportation remains fragmented. For manufacturers operating within global supply chains, where delays of hours can be expensive, these inefficiencies translate directly into competitive disadvantages. Labor regulations, while well-intentioned, create rigidities that discourage large-scale manufacturing investment. Hiring workers is relatively easy. Laying them off, even when market conditions demand workforce reductions, is extremely difficult. This asymmetry makes companies hesitant to rapidly scale up employment, knowing that scaling down would be legally complicated and expensive. Land acquisition for industrial projects remains contentious and time-consuming. Unlike China, where state ownership of land allows rapid mobilization for industrial zones, India's democratic system requires lengthy negotiations with multiple private landowners. Disputes over compensation and displacement can delay projects for years. These structural factors don't make manufacturing in India impossible. The country does have successful industrial operations. However, they raise the bar substantially. Only projects with exceptional advantages in other areas, such as proximity to very large consumer markets or access to specialized skills, can overcome these built-in inefficiencies. The numbers don't lie. A failed experiment. 4 years into the PLI scheme, the empirical evidence of failure is overwhelming and undeniable. The workforce in manufacturing hasn't grown by the projected tens of millions. It has actually shrunk by more than 15 million workers. These aren't just statistics. They represent families whose income sources disappeared, communities whose economic prospects dimmed, and young people whose career paths were blocked. India's share of global exports, rather than increasing to challenge China's position, remains below that of Singapore, a city-state with a fraction of India's population and land area. This comparison isn't meant to diminish Singapore's achievements, but rather to illustrate how far India fell short of its own ambitions. In specific sectors, the shortfalls are even more dramatic. Of 12 major companies that committed to the steel sector PLI program, 8 are projected to miss their 2027 production targets. Even domestic companies with every incentive to succeed are achieving only 50% of planned output. The Adani Group, despite its vast resources and political connections, reportedly hasn't even ordered essential production equipment for PLI-registered projects. Foreign investment, supposedly attracted by the PLI incentives, has instead fled. In 2024 alone, approximately $16 billion in foreign capital exited Indian equity markets. During this same period, foreign investment in Chinese markets increased by 42%. The contrast couldn't be starker. International capital actively chose to increase exposure to the very country that the PLI scheme was designed to compete against. Trade data adds another layer of irony. Despite 4 years of efforts to reduce dependence on China, India's trade deficit with its northern neighbor exceeded $120 billion. Rather than achieving manufacturing independence, India became more economically intertwined with the nation it sought to replace.